There's a war inside my head. Sometimes I wish that I was dead. I'm broken. So I called this therapist, and she said, girl, you can't be fixed, just take this. I'm tired of trying to be normal.
Hi everyone, how have you been? As I put a notice on the snowboard, I've been having trouble in this file conversion and even the recording issues in the software part. So I wasn't able to upload any new videos until now. So now at least this recording part has been fixed. So I'm trying to see if I can let's say go all the way down with the file conversion. So there's no problem anymore. So obviously we are a little bit behind the schedule. So for those the material that fell behind, I'm going to make them up by putting a little more amount of lectures until I catch up from now on. So we were discussing the common characteristics of life before. So now it's time for looking at the growth and development issue here. Both this growing issue and not all actually this development issue is something that not all organism can have this luxury. But anyway, whether it's a growth and development, both of them is the result of the cell division. Yes. So if you want to grow, you have to increase your mass by producing more number of cells through cell division. But that's only the case for so-called multicellular organism. So when it comes to the growth issue, it means by definition is increasing the number of cells. So this growth aspect for those single unicellular organisms like bacteria or yeast or some of the protists, almost all of the protists, even though they are eukaryotes, they are also a single-celled organism. They grow by simply increasing their number through cell division. However, the produced cells, they do not stick together by definition because they are single-celled organism. So this growth can only be achieved through this so-called cell proliferation. They just increase the mass, total volume, but each of these cells no longer belong to a single individual. So, and however, in growth, when it comes to this growth for the multicellular organism, then through this cell division, growth means increasing the whole body mass, just like us. So even though we started off as a single-celled fertilized egg zygote, but by the time you become an adult, usually the number of cells becomes anywhere between like several trillions. However, for the multicellular organism, this growth always go together with this development aspect. Development means each different newly produced cells as a result of the cell division during the growth, they do not stay as same as before, but they become different. That is called differentiation. So this differentiation along with the growth through cell division is very critical, and it's always a must. It is not an option for the multicellular organisms. So, like I said, these unicellular organisms, like bacteria or yeast, can only have this growth issue. They cannot have this development because they don't have any other cells. Single, sole cell is the entire thing for them. However, these multicellular organisms, their growth, which is maintained, which is achieved by the cell division, has to be always accompanied by development. So this is a summary of such development issue while they are doing this growth issue at early stage of typical multicellular organism like human. So starting from this fertilized egg, called a zygote, and at a very early stage of their growth, all they do is just like divide like crazy, and then they achieve many, although still small in size, but the small entity now consists of many different cells. At that stage, not only do they divide, which is a growth, but they also take care of this differentiation issue. So even though all these different cells have started from a single cell, in other words, they are all the descendant, the clone, so to speak. So theoretically speaking, all these different cells have to be identical because they inherited exactly identical genes, but not anymore. From the outside, at least, they appear very different. Like even when this newborn is still inside of the mother, but many different type of cells we now call as tissues. Different tissues develop. Like you can say, some different cells become muscles. Okay, some others covers, some others become like fat tissues, and even some other cells become a very rigid bone tissues and cells, just like that. Even some cells take care of these brains and nervous tissues, like that, and blood. So these the differentiation, they do look different because they have a different function. As I briefly mentioned, when we were looking at this hierarchical organization of multicellular organism in tissues and organs and organ systems. So they look different and they behave, they function differently, and this is extremely important for the multicellular organisms. So they don't stay together. They don't stay. They don't stay looking together, and they do exactly the same old functions, but each different part now being organized into different tissues and organs, like that, and have their particular very specific functions. That's some of the we can consider them such differentiation during the development is some type of adaptation as a way of living as a multicellular organism is probably the right interpretation. So the next characteristic is reproduction and heredity. So not all cell divisions are something that in order to in order to achieve the growth and development. Some different type of cell division is for this purpose of so-called reproduction. Why do we do this reproduction, the activity of reproduction? Because of this, our so to speak, our essence, the heredity, the genetic material. Here, what we have to understand is all living organisms, their ultimate goal is to live forever. However, practically speaking, that is not possible. So eventually, over time, all these things wear out. So they get old and they have to die. Regardless whether you are very short-living, single-celled bacteria or relatively very long-living elephant or human, that's the type of fate. That's the reality everyone has to face. So, in order to overcome or bypass such the fate, but still want to live forever, what they have come up with is this: passing their essence, which is a genetic material, the genome. Genome means the entire sets of their genes. Definition of genome is the entire makeup of genes, the whole total genes and DNAs in a single organism or the species that this organism belongs, is the definition of the genome. So this reproduction is actually the activity in which one's genome is being passed onto the next generation in the form of their offsprings. Okay. Why do they do? Because they want to keep their integrity. So as long as they maintain they intact the gene, and the next whatever the new cells, they inherit the existing genes, then it can be considered as identical, virtually identical to the self. That's the activity. So through this, by doing this reproduction, which is not actually the passing on the gene onto the next generation, which is defined as the maintaining the heredity, so that organism can now continue to live. So it maintains the continuity of life. However, by doing so, there are two different options, two alternative way of performing this reproduction. One is relatively straightforward. We call that as asexual reproduction. It doesn't involve any that activity we define as a sex. Okay. So in this type of reproduction, which is asexual reproduction, the genome, existing genome, we call it as a parental genome. This parental genome is exactly copied into the next generation, the offspring. So the result is clones are produced. Exactly copy, and that's it. That will be so. In theory, those offspring, since their genomes are exactly identical to the existing one, so they must be even in appearance. They should be 100% identical, and they will behave. They will react accordingly. So this is one such diagram illustrating the way of asexual reproduction. Actually, many different organisms rely on this asexual reproduction for their mode of reproduction. So here, even during this asexual reproduction, which is actually identical to the end result is identical to the other type of cell division we are doing during the growth and development in the multicellular organisms, one cell is splitting up and now become two different individual cells. Here, one very extremely important issue is before this split event, one's genome has to be doubled. So they have to temporarily increase the amount of the genes in an anticipation of this split event. Otherwise, the resulting new cells will get to inherit only half of the original amount, or the amount of the genes or genome. That would be such a disastrous thing. So this we call as a DNA replication or gene duplication is a very important prerequisite for any cell to divide. So this asexual reproduction is done by simply splitting up, but before you do that, you have to double up the one's genome. And so is the case in the normal growth issues, the cell division in the case of this growth and development, and as we can easily anticipate. In the next, the alternative type of this reproduction we call the sexual reproduction. Two different partners are engaged in this activity. So we usually call this a male and a female. So there are two cells, male cell and female cells, combined together to establish new sets of the identity. And here one big difference and the special thing about this sexual reproduction is the genome of a newborn, the offspring, is a mix of, so this is a half of the genome you get from the male side, the father, and another half of the genome you get from your mother. Okay. So this recombination shuffling, and also some other different type of recombination of the gene reshuffling also takes place before the actual completion of the production of these special cells involved in sexual reproduction. So anyway, the overall end result is total mix-up, recombination of the genome products. In other words, offspring, the sons and daughters of this sexual reproduction will have, all of them have some different genome combination than the previous parental genome, and also than the other siblings. So in this reproduction, or sexual reproduction, you have to produce some very specialized cells. We call them the gametes. Their functions are only this business of reproduction. So they first have to produce this gamete. Examples of gametes are sperms and eggs. Yes, easy to understand. And each sperm and egg combine together to restore this status of the zygote. And then you start all over again from this zygote, fertilized egg. So the special thing about this sexual reproduction is it involves the production of a special type of cells called gametes. As we are familiar with the case of sperm and eggs, those two very well-known examples of such gamete in many different types of multicellular organisms. And so the other types of so-called regular type of cells we call as somatic cells, which means normal body cells. These cells are the one, in the case of like human and other multicellular organisms, that are dependent on the sexual reproduction for their mode of reproduction. Their cell division and development are achieved by this cell division of these somatic cells, whereas for their reproduction, the special type of cells like gametes, like sperm or egg, depending on who you are, your sex, are produced and prepared, and later on, these cells engage in this activity. And the difference between these gametes and somatic cells is the amount of the genome. So somatic cells genome, if the somatic cell's genome is such, then the genome of gametes is they have the amount of those somatic cells of the genome. So that why? Because these cells are the ones who are going to be recombined, and then their genome will be restored into that of the somatic cells. That's why they have to reduce amount of the genome, the whole entire sets of genes. So, for example, in the case of human, all different humans in each cells 46 different chromosomes. I shouldn't say these are 46 different chromosomes, but the number of chromosomes in each cells of human is 46. However, in a given egg cell or in a given sperm cells, only 23 chromosomes. That means these cells went through the reduction procedure so that they have their genome into the exact half of the normal body cells, the somatic cells. And then later on, through the fertilization, these 23, each of them, will recombine to restore the 46 chromosome number. So that's why in every different individuals, the number of chromosomes 46. However, 26 of them you've got from your mother's side, and another 23 you've got from your father's side. Actually, those 23s are the different chromosomes, and since you have inherited the exact 2 sets of chromosomes from each of your parents, so for each different type of chromosome, you have another partner. So you do have pairs of different chromosomes. We will get to that a little bit more and later in next chapter. So here it means the sexual reproduction. The benefit of having this reduced chromosome number in gametes, I shouldn't say it's a benefit, but it's a must actually. You have to reduce this chromosome number in order to produce gamete. Otherwise, later when you have this zygote, fertilized egg, you will have a big trouble. The more the better? No, not in the case of chromosome number. Probably perhaps you will see the case of what kind of disaster you will see if you have one more extra chromosome in your body, in the cell. So in the case of chromosome numbers, more or the less number of chromosomes, both of them will cause a serious trouble. So anyway, so you have to reduce number of chromosome in gametes because you are going to restore them into the so-called normal chromosome number of 46 in the case of a human. And since 2 different individuals' chromosome sets, your mother and father usually did not know each other before they met, and then decided to devote their entire lives together for the rest of the life through marriage. So the result of this offspring of sexual reproduction is recombination, mixture of your father's genome and mother's genome. And also, we'll see this procedure a little bit more in detail in later on next chapter. But in the course of a production of a gamete, eggs or sperm, you go through a little bit of a reshuffling, chromosome reshuffling. We call that as a recombination, so that the gametes produced by the female or male in terms of its genetic makeup is not 100% identical to the parental cells. So that's another part through which this gene reshuffling, or we call it as a recombination, result in. So anyway, either way, so the end result of the sexual reproduction is variation. As we all know, the children of one parent do not have any exact identical, although they resemble, but not 100% identical gene makeup because of this reason. Not even their siblings' genomes are not 100% identical unless they are the identical twins. So that is actually huge benefit under some certain environmental conditions where environment changes. Every individual of the members of the population, if they have exactly identical gene makeup, then they will behave identical to in response to a certain stimulus. So this will probably end more likely to end up in all or non response. So they have a higher chance of being wiped out by environmental disaster. However, if the members of the population as all have a different genome, which means the variations are there, then some variants might be able to survive even under the drastically changing environment. So that eventually that survived one can re-establish a new population later on. So that's the huge benefit of having this producing variation in the population. Although this procedure, as you can easily imagine, this sexual reproduction is more cumbersome, so to speak. So more expensive, and it takes longer time, and it takes more rituals. So yeah, imagine if you can produce your offspring by simply take out some of your cells and then divide. Wouldn't it be really straightforward and more economical and nice? However, that danger of being easily eliminated by changing environment is actually the catch of asexual reproduction, again, we can say. So the final characteristic of life in common is this evolution. Nobody can ignore or escape from this procedure. So evolution itself, the concept of evolution is a kind of a theory. However, this theory is not a mere theory like as you think, but is a kind of almost a fact. And as I emphasized in the previous lecture, here in the field of biology, regardless of a fine branch of biology, you cannot ignore this evolution, because this is the fundamental base foundation of all life science as a science. Uh, so we cannot skip the discussion of this evolution. Uh, so this evolution, this concept can now explain all those observations you have wherever you go on Earth in life issues. Like the two seemingly contrasting characteristics of unity and diversity. So all different life forms, even though they are all different diversity issue. However, if you really look closely, they do share certain fundamental common characteristic features. Why? Why? At the same time, they all look and behave, and they are, in essence, they are all different. However, in essence and fundamentally at the base, they seem identical. It's because of this. They were all derived from one common. We established this thing as a single common ancestor originally. The very first common ancestor we call as a Luca, standing for the last universal common ancestor. So to speak, on Bible, you can take this as the Adam and Eve of human race, like the origin of all different organisms living on Earth right now. So this whole based upon, according to this concept of evolution, the very first common ancestor we designate as a Luca, whatever it is. It could be a single cell or whatever. We will get to that a little more detail in next chapter. And then diverged over time. So many different forms split from this original. So this tree branch-like diagram has been produced. So nowadays, what you see as at the pinnacle of here, many different organisms, like different species, you get to observe at the current time. Like if this was a human, then probably the most closely related your cousins, or and in terms of this evolutionary concept, as a chimpanzee. There's like that, so many different forms of life. However, if you go back all the way to the origin, like 3 or 4 billion years ago, then it all began as a one common single thing. It's the concept of evolution. That's why, because you were all different individual organisms were actually derived from one things they do, even though here they are all diverged forms, so they look different, behave different. However, they cannot get away, they cannot hide some common features because of this history. Is the idea of evolutions. Okay. Oh shoot. I have already put up this Luca last year with common ancestor. I didn't have to write down my ugly handwriting, this Luca. So sorry. So this idea of Luca, as we can see, this eukaryotes having this cells in the cell, having a nucleus in the cells, and prokaryotes. There are actually two different types of prokaryotes exist. in the life system. One is more familiar bacterial cells, and another prokaryotic cells which do not have any. So they are also like very similar to bacteria, but they are called archaea or archaebacteria, like sounding like more primitive bacteria. So they are those two different types of, but whatever they are, they all were in the beginning were derived from one common things, although we cannot exactly what it was. So this bacteria and archaea and eukarya, there were three different types of life that originated from single cell is the issue. And if you go further in detail, in more detail, in the case of eukaryotes, there are 4 different groups of eukaryotes: plants and fungi and molds and mushrooms and yeast are the members of this group. Fungi and animals, and the plants. And, interesting thing is about the idea of evolution. Actually, all these eukaryotic cells got split from each base of this branch-like diagram indicates the divergent point. So here, the split point between these all eukaryotes and the previous common ancestor was the archaebacteria. So we all derived from one specific type of prokaryote called archaebacteria, rather than the real bacteria. So you may think that the bacteria is a little bit more modern than the archaebacteria, so we are like a little bit more advanced, so we should at least be entitled for like being derived from more modern bacteria rather than archaebacteria. But that is not the case. Actually, archaebacteria was our more direct ancestor, was according to this evolutionary the findings. So the idea of this evolution is that why and how all these living things became so different and have like divided into many different species. The evolution explains this speciation. So this speciation procedure, if we take a look at a little further, first to define species, there are several different versions of species definition. However, the most popular and common and useful, especially in the case of animal in particular, is the one called the biological species definition. And here, under this biological species definition, different species are grouped by the ability of this interbreeding. So to define species, it is simply a group of interbreeding organisms. In other words, the members of same species can interbreed to produce viable offspring, viable and fertile offspring by sexual reproduction. So here the biological species definition takes this sexual reproduction by default. So that's why it is more difficult to apply to those who are relying on the asexual reproduction for their means of reproduction. But most of the animals that we know of usually do this sexual reproduction. That's why we can safely and more reliably utilize this biological species definition. So here, like for example, even though the a human and a chimpanzee are very closely related to the most closely related to two different species, but one member of human and a member of chimpanzee cannot mate. And let's imagine, even if they mate, they cannot. It is physically, mechanically impossible to produce any viable offspring. And also, further, in the example of a horse and a donkey, even though they can be forced to mate so that even they can produce an offspring sometimes, but that offspring is infertile. They cannot produce any further offspring. They cannot be engaged in sexual reproduction activity. So that's why the horse and donkey cannot be regarded as members of this same species. So this separation, reproductive separation or isolation, is the key. So like if we imagine each different species is in the past, they were the same members, bound by a common ancestor. If we imagine, for example, human and chimpanzee, there could have been a common ancestor long time ago. And at this point, when they were the members of common ancestor, maybe they were able to interbreed and produce fertile and viable offspring. However, somehow this separation, whether geological or whatever, the physical, biological separation must have happened. And over time, so these two groups became so much different to the point that they were not able to have the mating things. Then we classify these two different groups as two separate species, is the concept of this biological species definition. So in the existing population, right, so at that point all these members are under a common ancestor. To make this one existing population to split into the new groups, two new groups, so that speciation happens. To do so, to create such new species, the environment, the influence of the environment, Mother Nature, is the key factor. And that's the concept of so-called the natural selection. So the evolution by natural selection is the main idea of the current concept of this evolution. And in this procedure, usually 5 main elements are involved. They are, first off, this variation is the one. In the population, for evolution to start off, in the population, variation must exist in the first place. In other words, if all the members, individual members of the population are all same or the same, which is unlikely. Wherever you go, what you observe is every different individuals are different. Okay, so variation in reality, in practice, is no issues, but to follow the actual procedure in theory is this variation must first exist. Otherwise, evolution by natural selection. Natural selection, I mean, here natural selection means that the environment will select a particular individual of having different trait. So there must be already different variation exist in the population. And the second parameter for this natural selection to take place is that variation should be heritable. You can have any variations, but there are two different types of variation. One is called acquired trait. First, let's define the trait first. What's trait? Trait is the one that is determined by the gene under the classical concept. Your gene will determine a specific trait. Examples of traits. Actually, a gene will be responsible for creating a specific character. Like flower color is one such example of a character. Under the title of a flower color as one character, you can imagine several different traits. Trait 1, trait 2, trait 3, you name it. They are all different variations of a specific character. Like in flower color character, one can have a white flower color, another one of the same species can have a red flower color, yellow, blue, like that. And sometimes such character could be very complex one, like intelligence, human intelligence, or human height. But still, they are another examples of such characters. Under each character, you can have many different variations. Each of them can be regarded as a different trait. So that's the definition and concept of a trait versus character. Although this even the character in Korean, it is also translated. If you look up dictionary, this, however, in English, they are two different animals, like trait versus character. All these traits are the subcategory of a given character. But anyway, the important thing is all these characters are actually the result of a different gene, and not the different gene, but a specific gene will make a specific character, and the gene is different. That particular gene makeup is slightly different in different individuals. That's why, and that's how you have a variation as a different traits under a specific character. People, in the example, people, a person can have a black eye, another can have a brown eye, and etc. Because of even under specific same character, a specific variation in that gene will make different appearance in eye color, like that. So since those traits are the one resulting from a gene, so those traits should be the heritable one. Genes are the one that to be passed on to the next generations. So the reason here why all those variation in the population should be the one that heritable means if it doesn't, then in the next generation in the population, this natural selection procedure, which trait is more suitable to survive, so to speak, they have to start all over again from the get-go in each different the state, the generation. Why? Because the trait that are not the result of the genes, so to speak, the acquired trait, is not heritable. Some traits are not heritable. Those are defined as an acquired trait. Hey, go away. So this trait, even if one individual carry and show this particular trait, that person's offspring, the sons and daughters, will not inherit that particular exact trait. Example, the one you obtain any trait that through your under the influence of that environment, and in response to the particular environment, is usually an acquired trait, which is not a result of a gene change, but your actual the efforts. It's not going to be inherited, passed on to the next generation. You can easily imagine that even if you want to build a muscly body, so you go to the gym and work out every day, so you became something like you build up your body. But just because you did that doesn't mean that your son will be born like this. No, we all know that. So such environmentally influenced trait we define as an acquired trait, since it is not inheritable, so it doesn't play. It doesn't make as a valid player in the natural selection, because of the reason I have explained. Because if some particular acquired trait is get to be selected, Mother Nature is blind. They don't know whether that particular trait is an acquired trait or a heritable trait. Who cares? From the window of Mother Nature. But if that acquired trait get to be selected, unfortunately, that is not going to be like favored, or that particular trait is not going to have any extra benefit in the following generation. So it's useless. The next thing which is required to be present in the population for the natural selection to occur and then result in the actual successful speciation is this overpopulation. Why this? Even though there are several different variations exist in the population and they are all heritable, but if that population is under populated, so that means the significance of this overpopulation is the competition. Means not everyone can get what they want. Unless there is some kind of a competition existing in the population, each member will succeed in what that individual wants to achieve. Here the ultimate goal is reproductive success. So that they can produce more number of offspring. In other words, they can spread their genes to the maximum level as much as possible. Okay? And so on this realistic scenario, environment can support only limited number of individuals in terms of resources. That means not everyone will have an equal chance of reproductive success. Okay. Some may actually consider the key issue of this natural selection is the survivability. Yeah, that plays a very important factor too. But ultimately, what matters is this reproductive success. Okay. Survivability, which means viability, whether it's due to the strength or due to the intelligence, whatever, that is ultimately, if you think about it, is actually the thing that a factor influencing this reproductive success. So that if you have a better survivability, then you will end up in living more number of your offspring, so that you can leave much more amount of your genes in the next generation in the population. Is that actually that's all it matters. So here, without competition, everyone have an equal chance of reproductive success, though equally their genes will represent in the next generation. Then no matter how long you actually operate this process of natural selection, things will not change. However, in reality, there is no such ideal condition as there is no competition. Or there always you will be able to see competition because of this. So through overpopulation, which create this competition, so then this concept will occur. Only those who can leave more offspring in the next generation will be labeled as those who are fitted. So that's why another name, usually this natural selection, evolution by natural selection, the keyword is the survival of the fittest. Okay? So not all of them will be able to leave their genes equally on to the next generation. So those very small number of individuals will have a higher chance, so that over time their genes will dominate the populations. So if that is the case, that particular setup, so that particular makeup of the gene will entirely dictate this particular group of individual, which characteristically separate themselves from the rest of other groups of the population. They were among the same species, so each different populations, but they were under the same species, but not anymore at that point. Then now we are seeing the evolution of new species. So through that procedure, eventually this evolution of new adaptation to that particular local environment, which will eventually give rise to new species. Okay, so let's recap what I have briefly explained. This variation is different traits for a given character among the members of the population, and this variation is the one that is subjected to selection by nature. And as I have explained, only heritable variations contribute to the evolution. And this acquired trait, so although this is only strictly speaking, this is only according to the classical view of genetics. I will explain why I put this classical view of genetics here in an acquired trait. So this acquired trait is not heritable, usually regarded as, and so it's not going to be able to affect the process of evolution. So what is this acquired trait? Is trait obtained as a result of adaptation to the environment. Why this is an acquired trait and is not heritable? Because it does not change the DNA, the gene, DNA sequences of the gene. So under the classical view of the genetics, all different variation, which means different traits, are the result of different DNA sequences of the same gene. Okay? But as we can imagine, these acquired traits, even no matter how actually outside environment influence on you, the DNA sequence usually does not change. DNA sequence only change as a result of mutation. And unless that particular environment actually is resulting in the mutation, well, which that happens, okay? Then we don't call that event as an acquired trait of acquisition. No, it's not. So that doesn't count. So because of this reason, environment may be able to influence some traits, but it does not lead to the change in the genes. So that's why it is not heritable. However, quite recently, this view has been modified. So even though in this new version of the idea of genetics, environment can actually have this the consequence of heritable the acquired trait, even though they do not incur any DNA sequence changes. I will get to that later. So, an overpopulation means the competition for limited resources, so that inevitably result in particular individuals who are more fitted than the others. So, in this reproductive success, differences in reproductive success will occur for different individuals. So then, as a result of the adaptation, now eventually new species. And why? Because that more fitted individual genes now predominate that particular population. So that's that what I have just explained. It can be organized into this different forms. So basically the same thing. So if you have the time, you can follow through this another way of trying to understand this idea of natural selection in evolution. So having said that, let's take a look at two very famous classical the theory of this evolution. First, proposed by renowned biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. The significance of his theory of, although that's been regarded generally incorrect, is that he was the one for the first time tried to offer this very cohesive, reasonable explanation for the process of evolution. And this has been known to us as better known as this use and disuse theory. So if you somehow use one particular like trait characters, then it become more developed to the point of creating new like traits. So that now a new species having new trait is his idea. So that this use theory is the actually key driving force of evolution. Take this famous giraffe example. So, according to him, he explains the current modern day giraffe having such a long neck was because of this continuous effort, individual efforts to reach to the top, treetop. Perhaps in the particular environment, the food was only available on the high treetop, so each individual of the population had to attempt to reach higher and higher to survive. So initially, members of that population were just like any other similar animals like horses, had a shorter neck, unimpressive, undistinguishable short neck, but each individual kept trying to stretch their neck so that, just like it's an acquired trait, it's just like going to the gym and trying to develop more muscle. So they did, and so they kept stretching this, and eventually, voila! So all of them were able to reach to the what they wanted, level of this long neck. So now we are talking about the evolution of a new species of so-called giraffe. So here the key point is this change in trait was the consequence of this inner need. Oh, I want to do. So the effort, individual effort, can make the change in the trait, and that individual effort and that acquired trait can be heritable, so that they can continue on. Instead of starting all over again in the next generation, they can continue. They can pick up what they have left in their ancestors. Is the main idea. Okay, it may sound plausible, but the key drawback of this idea is we all know that this type of acquired trait is not heritable. So there is a really big hole in the theory. So that's why if you took the biology in your middle school or even elementary school, and perhaps you have heard this is Lamarck's idea of the evolution of a giraffe is incorrect because of that. So this individual adaptation effort under different environments condition generate the species diversity is under the premise of this acquired trait is heritable, which is not, okay? Because acquired trait generally does not get to change in the DNA sequence, and then it cannot have any impact in the next generation. The thing differently, the Darwin's, on the other hand, saw differently, and in his the renowned book of this Origin of Species by Natural Selection, the logic was like this: this variation is not unlike the version of Lamarck's. So the different variation was the result of individual effort, but this trait, in the form of these, they are encoded by the gene, is already exists in the population. Although you may not have noticed, but they do already carry this potential, at least potential to be different, is the starting point of this Darwin's theory. So then, under existing environment, maybe that particular variation does not need to show off. However, environment changes. Then now is the time for that particular trait emerge to have any kind of influence. Because now that trait became selectively advantageous. And because that trait is the result of the gene, the one who carries this trait with disadvantage. With disadvantage, they can have more offspring in the next generation, and so that over time it can be improved. So it can have a more refinement. So over generation, now they can be more pronounced. So then it became very distinguishable, quite different new species is his idea. Okay. So like the same, if we take the Darwin's idea to explain the long-necked giraffe, evolution of the giraffe, and then in early days actually there was a mixture of individual in that under particular environment, long neck, short neck. Okay. However, this the length of the neck doesn't have any kind of doesn't bear any selective advantage under that particular environment, so it doesn't get to be noticed or doesn't have any play in selection procedure. However, environment changes so that only let's imagine, like for the sake of argument, so only the foods became available only on the high treetop, so that those who can reach to that food source now have a better selective advantage. So those who have a better selective advantage can mate each other and produce their version of like their genes. The offspring having their particular gene makeup were produced more, so that now it became more and more pronounced. So now over time, quite some time later, all the members of the population has much longer next individual. All of them is the version of his explanation, which is generally regarded as actually true, which fit to the idea of evolution by natural selection. And if you look around, a lot of those present days of consequence of evolution can actually be explained by this natural selection of the particular variation existing in the population and throughout the procedure of selecting out. So when the particular trait is fixed, so that become the hallmark of the new species. However, in recently, new idea as scientists get to learn more about, became better educated about real nature of this genetics. So not always they get to realize that this so-called heritable acquired trait is not actually not at all BS after all. Some of them, at least some of the acquired trait can be heritable, is the one that is being recognized nowadays. So environment can influence and change the gene expression actually. So that's something new things we learned. So environment not only can, so what's the actually the reason behind this some trait change under the environment is actually usually the consequence of this, mostly gene expression. We will get to that, this real the details, concept and mechanism of gene expression in chapter 4 of this course. But gene expression means the if you have a particular gene, then what do you mean by the gene is expressed? It gets to produce eventually more number of what is good for the gene. Gene is eventually, the role is get to particular protein. Gene will get to produce protein, but not directly. First, this gene will have some kind of an intermediate messenger we call that as an RNA. Gene is made of DNA, but DNA gets to have some the representative or copies in the form of RNA, and this many copies of RNA is somehow that information into converted into the production of the protein, particular protein. So actually this protein is the result of one particular gene. Anyway, so then when we say the gene expression means how much, the amount of this RNA. When a particular gene is expressed high, that means that particular gene is making huge amount of RNA. If you have more RNA, then so will be the amount of a protein, that corresponding proteins. Think of the example like a growth hormone. If you have ample amount of growth hormone produced in a critical period of your development, then you will usually have a bigger body and taller height and like that. And at that particular period, if you have a much less amount of growth hormone produced usually, although it is a quite over exaggeration that many other factors can influence, but let's simplify these things for the matter of argument. And you will have a probably shorter stature and a smaller body. Okay. So this is all. So the trait of body size or height is a particular specific trait, and that trait is governed by what? In this case, the different level of gene expression. And what did I say about this gene expression? That gene expression can be controlled by the environment. So it is nothing to do with what kind of a DNA sequence makeup does one particular individual have, okay, mostly speaking. Although it is, in reality, it is quite difficult and complex matter, so I cannot really simply oversimplify it like that. But the idea is this. So the environment and at least can make the difference by influencing the gene expression. So now this is a very good representative example of such an acquired trait. And now, so even though it does not change in the so it can change in the gene expression, but that this particular level of gene expression sometimes, not always, but sometimes can be remembered by cell, and oh, I had this level of gene expression by this particular environment, and that level is fixed because that particular characteristic is transmitted into the next generation. Then we are talking about the inheritance of the acquired trait. So the bottom line is, the heritable acquired trait is not always impossible. It is possible. Maybe actually the human race differences can mostly be accounted for by this, so to speak, the inheritance of this acquired trait through this particular mechanism. So this particular characteristic of influencing the gene expression level, and that is called epigenetics. And this some of this epigenetic characteristic, not all, but some of this epigenetic trait can be transmitted onto the next generation, is all what I can share with you. Although this epigenetics is also very difficult concept and complex, so I should not go into more detail and then we'll stop over here. But once again, all I have to say is, not always. Sometimes acquired trait can also be heritable. So, in summary, this is what we can. We've been through 7 different common characteristics of life until now. But as I have already emphasized, that particular character itself is not at all important, but why every different living organisms carry the same such property in common. And here is how I think. The reason why you get to see all of these characteristics in common in every living organism is because they are all based upon this cell as a basic unit of organization. So, and that cell is inevitably the structural framework of the cell is it contains this gene. As we went over this, the 2 most fundamental feature of a cell is one is cell membrane and the other one is the genetic material. So with these genes, and what did I say about every living cells, their ultimate goal is this: they want to live forever. Okay. So they can go all the way through. So I want to live forever. But unfortunately, reality does not support that, such a longevity. Okay. Then what can you do? Okay, so the next best thing a cell can do is to reproduce. The essence of the reproduction is leaving your genes onto, passing your genes on to the next generation is the reproduction, right? So reproduction is all about carrying your genes over time. Good. However, there is one catch. This is the nature, chemical nature of these genes being made up of DNA. The variation, the DNA sequence will change. DNA sequence will change spontaneously, no matter what, over time. So what did I say about this, the relationship between DNA, your gene, and the trait? All different traits are the result of the DNA. And the reason why you have different trait is under the character, or the particular character, is because of this DNA sequence variation. Right. So, throughout the course of this reproduction, you will inevitably have this variation in each different individual. And if you have this variation, and what do you have? In each variation, nature, environment will notice and will be particular variation. The particular individual having particular variation will be selected through the procedure of evolution, right? But throughout this course, as at the level of an individual cell, in order to stay alive, you have to take care of these 3 business. 1, metabolism. Why do you have to worry about this, maintaining the metabolism? Otherwise, you cannot provide any energy, and you cannot provide any material, complex material to build. So this metabolism, every living cell has to go through this metabolism because of this energy requirement. And what about this responding to outside stimuli? If you neglect this particular issue, then you will be soon eliminated from this whole pool. Okay? So in order to survive, you have to take care of this issue too. And also, homeostasis. Not only do you have to take care of this business of worrying about outside environment, but also at the same time, you have to take care of some of the particular parameter inside constant. Otherwise, you cannot survive. So all these three things are necessary for individual cells survival. Okay, so only then you can achieve this goal of individual adaptation to stay alive. Okay, and through each individual contribution of such endeavor, the effort to stay alive, then now whole group-wise evolution can be possible, and eventually at the end of this game of a particular event of evolution, now new species may or may not arise. So we are keep going and going and going, and even though each individual cannot achieve directly this living forever, with all these individual efforts together combined, then actually each different individual is surviving and living forever, is the whole like a summary of what we have, all these common characteristics in any given life. Okay, so maybe I should stop the first session of this lecture at this point, and the next session of the chapter 1 is like since we have dealt with the issue of evolution, now what about the new horizon of the outlook or possibility of a new way of evolution, particularly in the human. Briefly, I'm going to talk about and finish the chapter 1.